So let's do introductions first. My name is William Tincup. I'm your moderator, or the moderator for this, not your particular moderator. I run President of Recruiting Daily. Been in the industry for 20 years at the intersection of HR, recruiting, and technology. So, and we have a wonderful panel, and they will introduce themselves.
Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Kenny. I run HR and business operations for a startup called Coda, and before that ran recruiting at Box from about 40 people to 1,200, so it was quite the adventure.
My name is Joseph. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Twine. We're basically building a Google Earth for chief people officers at mid-market and larger companies. So basically realized that the chief people officer role is about reconciling the macro and the micro. So macro level understanding, broad level analytics, micro level very quickly delving into individuals that comprise the trends that comprise those analytics. So set out to work with a couple dozen chief people officers as we bring this to market. Before starting the company, I ran an innovation team at Nike.
Very cool. My name is Kristen Hayward. I'm the Global VP of Talent at Flexport. I joined as our 40th employee and first talent hire, and I've seen the company 17.5x in the past 2.5 years. We now have 725 employees globally. Before that, I led customer success recruiting over at Zenefits, and before that, I built regulatory recruiting over at Charles Schwab.
So you have two HR people on the talent side and a CEO in the middle. And the whole idea of this is, how do you grow? How do you care about the financial part of growth while at the same time the people side of growth? And seemingly enough, is there a conflict? And one thing we will not do today, and we hope that this is good for you as an experience, is we will not pass the mic. Okay, so I've been in the audience before where you ask one panelist one thing, and they pass the mic, and essentially you want to beat someone to death because they keep answering the same question, like, oh yeah, I agree with what John said. So what we're going to do is we're going to do directed questions. And if somebody else on the panel would like to answer that, they can do that. And also we want to take questions from y'all. So at any given point, we're a small enough group, at any given point you want to ask a question of a panelist, direct it at a panelist, not to the panel, if you don't mind. So we're going to start with Joseph, as we should. Joseph, you have a values-driven firm. How do you hire, promote, and fire through those values?
Yeah, so I'll list off a couple off the top of the head that are especially interesting and valuable to us. One is deeply believe in having a really thoughtful culture. So I went to grad school, or I did my MBA, and one of the pieces of advice that you frequently get is argue as if you're right and listen as if you're wrong. I strongly disagree against the former clause. I actually think that people take the level of conviction you have as a credible signal of how much you actually believe it. So I actually believe that you should couch your statements with how confident you are in them. So we always hire for really, really thoughtful people. What that actually means is I'll go out to the team and I'll say, this is something I've been turning over in my head for months already, and I'm ready to fight for it. I'm still open to hearing why I'm wrong, but these are X, Y, and Z reasons why I believe it. On the flip side, if I don't necessarily think that there's a ton of thought behind something, I don't want to express my half-baked thoughts with the same level of conviction. So I'll say, this is something I have 20% conviction or confidence behind. Tear it apart for me. This is just an idea that I want to plant as a seed. We look to screen for people that have similar values and similar thoughtfulness when they approach it. We screen for intellectual curiosity. So every single one of our team members has some random, arbitrary interests that I can talk to them for hours about. We have one team member that's really into military strategy, another that's can talk for hours about strategy around Super Smash Brothers and strategies for winning that. But just being able to cultivate interests outside of work, I think, is really interesting, and those are things that we specifically try to solicit throughout the interview process.
So one of the things you talked to me about was this concept of relentless. And I was fascinated by it because no one's really ever really expressed that as a value or as something they look for in people. Could you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, so starting a company is really hard, and I wish Rajiv was on this panel. I'm going to give him a little bit of crap for not coming.
Are you sure?
But starting a company is really hard, and it's basically about bashing your head through a wall, and ideally the wall breaks before your forehead does. And when you approach it that way, you want people that are super, ultra relentless, basically able to take direction but then independently figure out and maneuver all the ways to get through any sort of challenge. One of the questions that we ask, I actually just like to ask binary yes-no questions and ask them to give me a little bit of content around why. Are you relentless? And give me an example of a time that everyone else told you something was impossible and you still did it. It's one of the things that we screen for, and I think it's really valuable in an early stage company to be able to do something like that.
Joseph is also my brother from another mother, in that he is a hip-hop aficionado. So if you have any hip-hop questions, you can direct them to either of us. We'll be good.
I'll take all of them.
We've actually started to share music. It's quite funny. Kristen, I want to talk to you a little bit about internal communications and how important they are to you, and what's your belief cycle on internal communications?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, I think the ability to communicate well is one of the most underrated skills in business. It's also one of the skills that it's the easiest to use tools and techniques to get better at and to really drive thoughtfulness around. So in the past 4 years, I've seen 2 companies now, 10x and 17.5x, really, really quickly. And one thing that I wish that we did differently in both scenarios was actually when you get to like that 30 to 50 size, it's really hard to see the pain points in your communication strategy because there's 30 or 50 of you and you know everyone's names. And oftentimes the person that you want to poke or ask a question to is right on the other side of you, or you can shout down the hall at them. And the larger you get, the harder it becomes to manage. So one thing that I would do differently next time is actually at that 30 to 50 stage, take the time as a team to define communication principles in the same way that you would define values principles. And if you think about like communication and culture can go directly hand in hand, and it can be little things like, we don't give tough feedback to one another in writing. Like you take the time and you have a face-to-face conversation with the person. As you scale a company, that face-to-face conversation may be thanks to Zoom video. I have a lot of face-to-face conversations in my role with Zoom video, but just that level of thoughtfulness, and then when you bring people into the organization, because the problem gets exponential as you grow, when you bring people into the organization, you're able to introduce them to the values and principles as to how you communicate and why. If you think about it, so many companies do this differently, and we've seen some recent interesting email leaks that show us certain companies put a lot of really interesting things in email that we might not as a company. So it's really helpful for new joiners as well to just better understand the culture and what goes in a public Slack channel. Right. Tip there, it's probably not publicly shaming other teams or other people, but it can become a really important foundation to scaling your business, and that level of thoughtfulness is required at the beginning.
When there's 5 people, that's probably a thing you can do. You probably can say, hey, Ted, you didn't do your good job yesterday at that thing. But when you're 500 people, probably not. Do you screen, or when you're recruiting folks, do you ask them about communications? Do you talk to them about communications? Or does that happen kind of more or less in the onboarding?
Absolutely. So we actually dig into communications a couple of different ways in our interview process at Flexport. So the first thing that we look for in candidates is really a client empowerment mentality, which is one of our company values. So really looking for how do they communicate difficult messages, how do they communicate day-to-day information, what's their inclination towards proactive and getting ahead of certain situations. And then we also look at upward feedback and difficult conversations, and what type of experience do they have having that in their current job. And sometimes it's more symbolic of the company that they're at today as to whether or not, for instance, do they feel they can give their supervisor upward feedback. Not every company values candor at the rate that we do, so trying to better understand their current environment and how they feel about their current environment as well. So I think it's a really important part of communication.
It's almost become a part of your values or part of your screen. Interesting. Kenny, I want to ask you about, a part of growth is obviously sales for everybody, right? So when you're looking for salespeople, what traits or what characteristics are you looking for in salespeople?
Yeah, at Box, Aaron, the founder and CEO, had a very interesting approach to hiring. When he and I first met, he told me, Kenny, I want to have a company where every single role is filled by a world-class individual. And he didn't care if that meant the VP of engineering, the head of sales, or the receptionist at the front desk. So we kind of had a rubric for each person. First, in the role that they're coming in today, are they going to knock it out of the park? Are they going to do an excellent job of that? Second, we saw how quickly the environment was growing, and how much people were having to take on more than their role really called for. So we looked at, is this person going to excel in the role as it's going to be in 6 months or 2 years, or maybe that 2-year job is suddenly going to get pushed up to 3 months from now. So we actually hired for the future. And third, we look for, are they adding to this organization in some real world-class caliber? Is it, have they done something exceptional in their past that really stood out? Are they, an Olympian, an athlete, just knocked out of the park in their previous job? But we wanted to have every hire have something really exceptional about them, and we held that for sales across all of our other positions as well.
That's fantastic. Let's stop real quick. Anybody have any question for the panelists? No? Good. Oh, go ahead. Yes, sir.
Maybe the sales one. So many people typically hire from very specific experience or background that they can sort of believe is that they can place that into that new environment and it'll be successful. Did you look at it that way, or did you look at it differently?
It's a great question. So we had a lot of traditional account executive type roles that our sales managers and directors went in and tried to hire people that had the same track record, high quota achievement, et cetera. And I think you can't go wrong doing that in most organizations. But when we were about 700 employees, we kicked off this really intense people analytics endeavor that replicated a lot of what Google did, which is like really study what predicts success in these organizations. And in the data, we found something pretty shocking. So our sales managers were going in and trying to hire people like them. So your extroverts, your former athletes, your people that we actually gave them a personality scale, scored really, really high on the introversion-extroversion scale. But when we actually broke down our sales team, there was kind of a bimodal hump. We had a huge cluster on the very high end, and then like this 25% of our population scored right in the middle, which we call ambiverts, like you're context switching a lot between the two. And for whatever reason, a huge percentage of our high performers were in that ambivert category. We had to go in and dig in. Why was that? We've got this process that's designed to find the extroverts because the athletes are the ones that turn out to be successful in sales. Well, it turns out to be a really, really good sales rep in our environment. You had to comb through Salesforce. You had to actually not talk, and you had to listen really well to customers. And those were the people who, during the interview process, actually had to hide that part of their identity and show that they were, extroverted enough to cut it in this environment. But our best performers were coming out of this cohort. So we actually went and flipped our interview process to go stop screening for the athletes, et cetera, that we were looking for before, and find the folks that were actually comfortable being behind Salesforce and crunching through numbers and doing the activities that led to really, really good success. And our sales leader, Jim Herbold at the time, he was probably not your traditional sales leader. He was much more introverted and all of that, but turns out like that quality in him carried through a lot of success in his role too.
So a quick follow-up to that. Sales, kind of the independent contributors versus sales managers. Have you ever had the person that could go and do both?
We promoted a lot within at Box. I think we had a goal of 40% of our manager hires at least came from within the organization. So I think when we hire for individuals, we were hoping to bring in that personality of being able to translate to a manager down the line. We strongly believe in good cultures, promoting from within, understanding the DNA, and today the person that's running, I think all of West Coast sales, or actually maybe all of US sales, started as one of our first account executives in the company.
Wow, that's fantastic. Joseph, when we talked, part of growth, especially from a founder's perspective, is raising money or somehow raising money. You talked to me about diversity, actually, which I found fascinating because you're talking about looking for diversity in people that would invest in your company, potentially sit on your board, et cetera. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we set out to raise a couple million in a seed last year, and when we did, I felt it would be ironic if we ran a people analytics company that's focused heavily on diversity and inclusion and didn't embody some of those values in our own company as well, in our investor group as well. So wanted to be an HR tech company that didn't immediately create HR technology violations. We got started by...
It's actually rare, by the way, just FYI.
So we wanted to do something a little bit different. starting the process, basically said we're going to assemble a coalition of strategic angel investors that are going to be able to kind of weigh in on a lot of the topics and things that are top of mind for us right now. Starting goal is basically we need to make sure that we at least have 2 female angel investors as part of this round. We ended up raising from one kind of lead investor on a Sand Hill Road firm, but then ended up filling that up with 24 angel investors, and 40% of them were women. So a very, very explicit approach to systematically doing that in the first place. So going out, kind of talking to our lead investor, sourcing the best female investors that he knew. We went to Pamela Thomas-Graham, who used to be Chief Diversity Officer or Chief Talent Officer at Credit Suisse. First angel investment that she ever did. So just making sure that we could at least hit those diversity targets and just making sure that we had representation across the board.
You'd be amazed at how many HR software companies aren't great at HR.
Yeah.
Shocking, but true. Kristen, you mentioned grit and resilience as characteristics that you're looking for when you hire. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So I think there are 2 qualities that are really important in individuals when you think about building a company designed to solve hard problems, and really making sure that you're building a team of people that are going to stick with you through the journey. One of the most underrated qualities of grit, I think a lot of people associate grit with a quality of people that will stick around with you through tough times, which is great. Obviously, when you seek to build a company, you don't plan on giving your employees tough times, but they're inevitable when you're solving hard problems. But one other thing that I think is really important about grit in employees is people that have grit, to your point about relentlessness, actually will continue to seek the solution again and again and again, and they'll have that underlying drive to make sure that whatever the business problem is they're trying to solve, they don't just say it's unsolvable or that it's too hard. They're going to keep going after those problems, and when you're building a business and hard problems, you need people that are going to do that. And then I think resilience sort of goes along the same way. People that want to take on big challenges and go on a long journey. Building a company is full of so many ups and downs, and it's easy to find people that ride the ups with you. It's much harder to find people that in the times of downward spirals will actually remember what it's like to be up and help pick you up and help you get back there.
So I'm curious about drive, grit, resilience. Obviously, we're talking about growth, right? How do you bring those questions out to the hiring managers and out into the recruiters as ways to talk about it? Like, what questions do you ask, or kind of what answers are you looking for to kind of bring back drive, grit, and resilience?
Absolutely. And another one I would add that I think is really important for growing companies is humility. People that admit mistakes early and often, because people that have humility are more likely to see when they're not quite where they need to be, and more importantly, if they have that drive and that grit and resilience, pick themselves up and get themselves back there. So I think we do a couple of things in our interview process. One we do that I'm really passionate about is we do a structured interview process where we use case studies, and with case studies, we have them solve real business problems that we would actually face. I think it makes it more engaging for the candidate, because instead of it just being how many water bottles can we fit in this room, which could be interesting for some people to solve, but feels a little bit less relevant. It's an actual on-the-business problem that they're going to face. And solving that problem also gives the candidate a taste in the role, but it allows you as the hiring manager to look past the person talking about their background, which some people may do fantastically and some people sadly may not be the best at talking about themselves, and solve that business problem. With the grit in particular, I like to actually talk to candidates about what does it actually look like. Like, tell me about a hard situation that you've been in. And what were the different milestones? What were the times that you wanted to hit that goal? And what were the roadblocks that you felt along the way? It's also great because you learn a little bit more about what the candidate's bar is. So if you have a candidate that tells you about that time they ran out of hard-boiled eggs in the kitchen and the struggle was real, some of these may or may not be real stories. You also get a sense of what the candidate's thinking a difficult situation is versus if someone tells you about a true business challenge that they face. The other great thing about behavioral questions in general is you also learn how the candidate relates to other people in this situation. And in particular, one of my favorite questions to ask candidates is, if I were to ask your manager to rate you on a scale of 1 to 10, what would they rate you and why? And so many people are 10s. But I also get like 2s and 4s and 5s. And the best part about the question isn't actually the number, but it's the, well, why? And then seeing how they're absorbing that feedback. And is this someone that's an owner that's taking on the feedback? Or is this someone that says, my manager thinks this? It's like, okay, well, does your manager think that, or do you really need to work on that patience? And if so, what are you doing about it?
That's fantastic. Kenny,
question.
oh yeah, go ahead. Oh, whoa. Ben Godkin with ATAP. What are you here? Wait a minute.
I love grit. I had a client startup in New York where the CEO, that's what he screamed over. That was his thing. But what they were found, the struggle they were having is the interview teams were passing candidates along that were getting rejected by the CEO because they weren't passing the grit test. But part of the problem is they had not defined, built alignment around that definition. Have you done that in your organization? Is it understood what grit really means, and is there alignments with the interview teams about what they're looking for specifically with examples?
Absolutely, and that's a great question. So I think one of the most important parts about defining these traits, right, grit, resilience, humility, is actually what does this mean for us and our company? And it's sort of the same idea with values, right? Values can easily become words on a wall, but if we don't have shared understanding as to what that word means, and also indicators, and especially when you're growing a company really fast and maybe you have some new managers interviewing, helping them understand what are the indicators and what are the red flags. And like a great example is, asking someone about a project that they've worked on. Usually if you work on a project, other people are involved. So when you're talking about your working experience with other people in an interview process, there's some indicators of like giving credit to others, cooperating, and then there's some potential red flags to watch for. Everyone else you worked on the project was awful. Not you, but everyone else. So I think that really having the shared understanding, the indicators, and then also watch for these red flags is really important to a structured interview process because we all have to agree on what grit means. Otherwise, we're going to test it, and we're not going to be testing it in the same way.
One of the things we found at Box on grit is the recruiting team, which was the first pass of all resumes, heavily screened out folks that were job hoppers, so every year switch it in every 6 months. And you talk to any of these candidates, they always have a great reason on why that was the bad situation for them. And then years later when we did this people analytics project, we studied grit as one of the characteristics, and there was no correlation to success. And we were first shocked, like, oh, why the heck did grit not tend to matter? And then we realized, oh, we've got an incredibly gritty population. Like any of the really obviously non-gritty people didn't actually make it into the sample set because the recruiting team was so heavily screening for that. But we found out that was actually a pretty efficient way of avoiding people that would bounce the second stuff got hard. Is there's some people that just have a pattern of jumping ship pretty often, and trust your recruiting team to enforce that pretty easily.
Nice. Ben Godkin, Association of Talent Acquisition Professionals. Talk to him if you care about that. I would suggest all of us should care about that. Kenny, I want to talk to you a little bit about Box. Now that you've had a little bit of time to kind of breathe, be out of that for a second, what mistakes do you think you made? What big learns do you think you had?
Yeah, I think it's hard to call these mistakes. I think you look at Box and it's a pretty successful story. They're public and doing very well today. But I remember before we kind of hit that hypergrowth phase, the company made the very intentional decision of we're going big on the growth side. We are going to hire a ton of sales reps. We're going to build a massive sales organization because that's the only way to get this product deployed into the world. And once you go down that path, it's really difficult or painful to change course. And I think if you follow the story of Box right before they went public, the market switched from not caring about cost and burn to really paying attention to how you're generating revenue. And suddenly, Box didn't look as pretty to the investors in the outside world. In my current startup today, Coda, we're 40 people. We're just now taking the product to market. And our leadership team has the very opposite approach. It's very, very intentional and deliberate about growth. And we're not assuming that lots of sales reps is the only way to get your product out to the world. If you look at other companies out there, and Google is the easy one, like they'll avoid hiring sales reps whenever possible. They'll try to figure out how do we grow using product, using spread. So right now we're hiring a small number of people and really testing alternate methods of getting the product to spread. And one question I think a peer CEO had suggested to us is, is your product bought or sold? And if you can find a way to get your product to be more in the former category, you can build different types of sales organizations that don't rely on headcount nearly as much.
Nice. Any questions before we go to Joseph?
I'd actually like to chime in on Kenny's answer. One of the interesting byproducts of just rapid growth, which I can kind of speak to firsthand, as well as just like talking to chief people officers across industries, is twofold, right? One is kind of in a previous life, grew a team that also grew about 10x over the scale of a couple years. And one of the inevitable challenges we ran up on was just the decrease in the hiring bar, right? It was one of the mistakes that I think I made the first time because we were so urgently pressed to grow the team as quickly as possible that we basically lost touch of a lot of the values that you had outlined early on. We stopped screening for them. We were basically said, we just need to throw butts in seats as quickly as possible, and it's a mistake I'm committed to never making the second time around. And it's interesting because I watched like so many CPOs across the valley that are also going through similar hypergrowth stages where you're going from 100 to 250 to 1,000 employees within the span of a couple years. And they all deal with those issues as well. So how do you actually strengthen a recruiting pipeline? And how do you actually approach your process in a thoughtful manner without just throwing more heads at it? It's really interesting because I was talking to Adam Ward of Pinterest, who Kenny kindly introduced me to. By the way, Adam says that Kenny's a legend, so I just want to put that out there for everyone else. And his thought was he's affiliated with Facebook in some way, right? Or worked.
He was an early recruiting manager at Facebook and then ran recruiting at Pinterest.
Yeah, and he said the only way that Facebook has been able to scale operations has just been continuously throwing more and more recruiters up. They comprise over 10% of the workforce now. There's probably a smarter way to do it. I hadn't figured it out in a previous team, but I'm trying to figure it out this time around. And I'm trying to do it while still protecting the integrity of the quality of the team. And I think that's a huge challenge that remains to be solved.
You and I had a fascinating conversation about HR and recruiting and how to optimize, especially optimizing towards kind of an ROI. Because it's easier, it's easy to do in sales. It's easy to do in marketing in some ways. But HR and recruiting, a little bit harder. So give the audience a little bit of your take on that optimization.
Yeah, this one is super interesting to me. So we talked about this, right? There's been billion-dollar companies built around optimizing your click-through rates by 2 or 3%, right? You can optimize the crap out of your sales and marketing funnel. You build HubSpot and Marketo and all these companies that help you build great sales and marketing operations, and yet you have so much people data that I believe is ultimately being underutilized, or HR data that's ultimately being underutilized. So I think there's a huge gap there. I think the reason why HR tech hasn't reached the point of evolution of like the sales and marketing technology landscape is that ultimately sales and marketing technology are much more, I've already lost someone. He didn't like the sales and marketing. This must be a sales and marketing person. But they haven't reached that level of quantification around ROI because simply it's much more difficult to measure, right? You need longitudinal studies where you actually look at a person that joined, look at their interview performance years ago, and then a couple years later, you look at how they ended up performing in their performance reviews. So the timelines are much longer. Sometimes there's not direct tie-in to specific revenue targets or specific attainment targets, and I think that makes it more difficult, but I think there's a lot of novel and unique methods, some pioneered at universities around the world, some that have been applied to Box already that are getting much better at quantifying people value, so to speak. Both just teams across organizations, but also the HR organization itself. So like, can you quantify the value of your HR department?
Right. I've only met one person in all of my travels that has created a profit center out of recruiting.
Interesting.
A gentleman's named Brad Warga, who used to be at Caesar's Palace, then went to Salesforce, then he went to Guild, now he's at Heinrich Struggles. Anyhow, when he was at Caesar's Palace, he built a poker tournament for MBA candidates. Okay, so he went around to all the top 50 business schools, and he had them come to play Texas Hold'em. And so they had to pay to get in. Okay, so first of all, they got to pay to get to Caesars. Okay, they got to pay to get into the tournament, and then he went around to all the brands that wanted to recruit this type of talent, and he got them to sponsor the event. So he literally created profit out of recruiting. And of course, he was recruiting too, right? I've only met one though. Only one that's created a profit center out of recruiting. I'm
We'll
sure
be the
there's other
second.
stories. Kristen, I wanted to ask you another aspect of growth is something you talked about is promoting from within, taking some of the people that you already know that have kind of the culture, the values, et cetera. Talk to us about your philosophy about promoting from within, but also have you ever had that gone sideways? Have you ever had a promotion from within veer off and not do the intended?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, I think promoting from within is one of the most important things you can do to continue to grow your culture. As you have people that are already doing very, very well and already living your values and know your business, to see them be able to take the next step in their career. One, it just gives everyone on your team hope, but two, it also helps you empower yourself with a leadership team that intimately knows your business. I think it's really, really important to balance internally promoted leaders with external leadership hires. I think being side by side with someone that's an experienced operator and has been at the leadership level before ultimately will help elevate the team. And that's one of the things I'm really proud of with my leadership team is we're about 60% promoted from within, 40% of people that we brought in as experienced operators from the outside, and seeing how they teach one another the business and being a leader, because I think our peers can be one of our biggest sources of learning from a business. I've never personally had it go sideways, but I see it go sideways frequently, and I think one of the biggest things to remember is oftentimes we think of like, okay, we've promoted this person, we've just made this investment, and then now it's time for them to prove themselves. That sometimes we forget our role as leaders is when we promote someone from within, we're also making a commitment to them, and we're making a commitment to work with them to help bridge the gap that a seasoned operator that you bring in externally would fill. And so we have to be willing to make that investment. And if you're not willing to make that investment in someone, if you don't have the time or the money to help them with external resources, it can actually be really detrimental and, to your point, go quite sideways.
Right.
Another thing that I think has been really important about our business is in growing my team at Flexport, I've been able to grow every one of our recruiting businesses today from 0 to 1 before I had to make a decision to either promote someone to run the business or bring in someone else. And I think in doing that, and being like the original entrepreneur, it really helped me make sure that I was either promoting the right person to run the business and take it from 1 to 10, or to have a really good sense of what the right candidate looked like externally based on what I personally learned from getting to 1 myself. And I think that's been one of the best things is, you know, when you promote and hire people and they take it from 1 to 100 way faster than you ever thought, and getting to see just how they can really level up the business and take it to the next
bask
level.
in their success, of course,
Yes,
right?
because it's the best feeling, right, when you hire people that are better at you than that job.
One point I'd add on the promoting from within thing, the companies that I see do this the best often are promoting their best individual contributors into managerial roles, and sometimes that's not the right career move for everyone. And some orgs actually then manage that person out and get them out of the company, but the best ones find a way to have a safe path back to being an individual contributor without getting demoted. And I think setting that up early and often as part of your culture allows people to say, hey, I'd like to try the management thing. You know what, not for me, I'm gonna go back to just being a great IC.
Apple does that really well. I learned a lot about, I don't know if any of you have read the book Radical Candor by Kim Scott. What I was not expecting from the book is how much he compared the cultures of Google and Apple. And one of the key things about Apple is they really value what they call a rock star, which is someone that is a top performer, but might not have a huge growth trajectory. And a lot of other startups, unfortunately, turn those people away because we're taught that the people that we want are the people that are like, I want to be in your seat in 12 months. And so I think that's a really, really good point, and this is something I've learned Apple does really well.
Fantastic.
One of the things we do that's a little bit unique at Coda is we do level independent ranking of our company, because we don't want the way people are valued is to be based on their managerial or vice president level, et cetera. We want to know who's adding the most value to the organization all the way down to who's adding the least. And actually we separate compensation from that. So there are managers who manage people that make twice as much as they do, because it's not the managerial skill that we value the impact in the organization. And our CEO, Shashir, used to run all of YouTube, and he ran YouTube's entire compensation on this formula that comp should be level independent. He had engineers that were a year out of school making $1 billion a year. And that's rare to see an engineer making $1 million a year, but he said, if we lost that engineer, XYZ systems keel over. And so when you start to measure compensation from an impact standpoint, it kind of changes the game a little bit.
That's fantastic. Oh my goodness, my mind is racing.
Yeah, this is a hot topic, and I actually did a couple of years of research in internal mobility at Fortune 500 companies. So a view from the enterprise side is basically when we actually looked at longitudinal studies of roughly a dozen companies, Fortune 500, all of them, we found that the single most powerful lever that you could actually pull to reduce employee attrition in the first place was simply better internal mobility. At smaller companies, so 100 to 500 employees, obviously all these techniques, relatively unscalable techniques, will work. But at larger companies, you saw J&J, for example, actually deploy algorithms to identify which moves across different functions were most successful. So this person, because they have codified knowledge or institutional knowledge inside of marketing, is actually going to bring a lot of value over to sales. And they would just do that at scale, so literally move hundreds of people across different organizations based on this. So Nielsen was one of our early clients. They ran a study. They found cut attrition risk by, I think, 48% if you lateral someone, and 60-something% if they promoted someone. So ultimately ended up becoming a huge push around internal mobility.
What's fascinating there as it leads to people under 30, that's one of the interview questions. There's 3 interview questions for people under 30. One's what's next. The second is how are you going to train me? How are you going to skill me up? And the third is how are you going to praise me? So the people under 30 are asking that question of recruiters, which isn't historically a question recruiters are really great at. I would actually say that most companies aren't great at internal mobility in general. But recruiters, that's usually an HR question. That's after the onboarding experience. So that's fascinating. Before we get another question in, does anyone have any other questions that they'd like? Sir?
I think all of you, mentioned sort of that, setting the criteria, defining the criteria, and that also goes for promotions as well. But do you have any examples of how you calibrated that and or how you communicated that to make it woven into the culture so that everybody understood it as well? Versus it's easy to understand it in HR, but if you're the operator and you're trying to understand why am I getting this person, and you're confused a little bit as to why you're placing this person in this role and you're thinking it's a misfit.
I think a couple of things. So
Okay.
From a recruitment perspective, it's something that we as recruiting partners do with our hiring partners, is actually sit down at the initial intake and really define what does success look like in this role and what does it look like to be successful in this role in 90 days and 180 days. And from there, make sure that instead of just doing like a cookie cutter, we want this person to have a bachelor's degree and 4 years of selling experience, making sure that the profile that we're going to seek matches the skills that we're going to test for, which is going to set the person up for success for performance. I think in a leadership perspective, though, once someone is on my team, we do a couple of different things. So one thing that my leadership team and I sat down and did with our recruiting partners is just to find expectation setting for different roles, and everything from what are SLAs in terms of different response rates, like what does it look like to be a great recruiting partner, and then actually sit down with our team and actually have them rank themselves on that criteria, and then we rank them on that criteria and discuss the delta. And then from there, we set quarterly goals, and we do leader set goals and then also bottoms up goals. So that way we're working in our business and on our business, filling in that gap.
Very good. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
So I had a question about sort of how you handle some of the data for all of those candidates that don't make the cut. So there's a lot of talk about, once from the time that you select a resume, for example, you have their resume data, then you have their interview data, then you go to their performance data. They're still looking at how that candidate fares. But what do you do with all of the data of candidates that didn't make the cut, and how do you sort of optimize or get better going forward based on that?
And who would you like to direct that to?
Sure.
The legend.
I think one of the things Joseph's doing to bring more data into the people space is amazing because it's so hard. You're dealing with an incomplete data set, and anytime a company passes on someone, they actually don't know how they would have performed in that company. So it's a very difficult problem to begin with. One of the patterns I'm seeing now is companies are much more self-aware about the number of different points of bias they have throughout their interview process. And as organizations move to be more diverse, they actually go and pick apart their interview process in all the different segments where they've introduced bias and find candidates they passed on in those stages. And they're going back and re-interviewing them and finding at a very, very high rate that those people are turning out to be really successful in their organization. So I know this is a pattern that Facebook for sure has embraced a lot in the last couple of years. They had this very infamous, culture interview that they've now ripped out of their process, brought back all those people and are hiring them, and they're turning out to be great employees.
That's fantastic. An aspect of growth that you and I talked about was this adage, or this thought of, hire slow and fire fast. What's your take or what's your beef with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've lived two different tales. At Box, we hired very, very fast. We had lots of checks and balances, so I think we did a good job keeping the quality high. But it was very much a velocity-driven organization. My current company, we spend way more time with each individual candidate. I think we're spending 20 plus hours with the candidate in terms of homework and evaluation and selling and all of that. And we make very few offers, and our offer rate ends up being north of 90%. So it could be Stockholm syndrome with people spending so much time with us that they just decide to accept at the end of it. But I think one thing we've been fortunate as a result is we've avoided making a few hires that we were literally on the very edge of making that would have been really irreversible. One of them was a person who would have run our go-to-market function, had a track record of success running two very, very strong sales organizations, but it would have been too soon to hire that position. And because we took our time actually making that decision and embraced the very thoughtful culture of like, how is this going to impact the company, we realized that he would have immediately gone off and kicked off building a certain type of team, brought in a bunch of other hires, and it was just too early for the company to do that. So I think we're in our fourth year of being in business, and we still very much spend much more time than I've seen average, with a candidate. And I think it's probably the right move for us for the indefinite future.
Sounds thoughtful, actually.
Follow up on,
Yeah.
You said Facebook is kind of throwing the culture
Yeah.
thing out the window. What are the risks of, the culture fit is in such a buzz
Yep.
term,
Yep.
but now you're starting to see organizations realize the challenges and the risks that come with, focusing on hiring for culture fit. What have you seen, and if your mindset's changed around that topic?
Yeah, I think the biggest pitfall with the culture fit thing is it's actually another way of saying hiring people that are just like me, and the realization that diverse teams are actually what lead to the most successful outcomes. So the mere elimination of that and actually anchoring it much more to values and hopefully measurable values in your organization, building structured interviews where you're looking at the what and the how, but you're not specifically asking these biased culture fit questions. And doing things to make sure your top of the funnel is really diverse is seeming to help companies build much stronger teams and cultures.
Well, I've said that in the past is diversity and inclusion creates conflict. Conflict creates innovation. Innovation creates market share. So there's actually a business case for D&I outside of just the humanity of it. Sure. Diversity and inclusion creates conflict. Conflict creates innovation. Innovation creates market share. The purpose of D&I is, well, there's a humane part of it, of course, but there's another part of it is you want people to disagree. You actually want conflict. And the culture fit, I used to do this bit when I ran an ad agency where I want to have a cup of coffee or I want to have a beer with the person. But that's actually the wrong way to go about it, because the only people I'd go to have a beer with are people like me, which who the hell wants to be around people like me? So we've got about 5 minutes left. I want to see anybody have any questions for the panelists? I've still got a couple. No? Okay, good. From a growth perspective, favorite interview question? And it could be a knockout question. It could be any type of question. I'll go first, so y'all can think about it. Mine is, we're all misunderstood. How are you misunderstood? So that's my favorite question, just to see where they go. Then my second favorite question is, what's your favorite hip hop song? And to get an explanation. So if they first say, I don't know anything about hip hop, it's like, okay, well, you're done. You're out of the interview.
Yeah, so mine isn't one question, but a series of questions, and I call it the torque. So I torque candidates, I don't torque candidates, I torque them. But it stands for thread of reference check, and it's an interview methodology that's borrowed from a lot of executive recruiting firms when they're looking at hiring C-level several people. They go through and they ask them, talk to me about your 3 previous managers, and what would they say about you? What would they rate you on a scale of 1 to 10? What would they say your strengths are? What would they say your weaknesses are? And when you frame it in that lens of, I'm going to go after this call and go talk to your manager, and people have that implicit fear, you end up getting probably 90% overlap on what the references would have actually said. So it kind of either validates what you get later in the data, or it kills the need for it, however you want to approach it.
There's actually technology that does that. It used to be called Check, but it's called Outmatch, that does 2 assessments. It does a self-assessment. So you have to, as a candidate, you have to go through an assessment. And then it puts you have to put in 10 email addresses of people that will give you a reference. They go through the exact same assessment. And so then it aligns that data. So it's kind of interesting.
I would say reference data is the single most important piece of data you can get in the interview process. So anything that you can incorporate like that's great.
Yeah.
Well, favorite rap song is Table Stakes, obviously. After that, I typically ask for pivotal moment in life or like hardship in life and how you got through it. So the context behind that question is I went through, or was in an accident many years ago when I was younger that it basically gave me like a 50-50 shot at living. And I think it formed so much of who I became as a person and my mentality and outlook. I don't necessarily look for a hardship that's as dramatic as that, but I always do look for how a person responded to that adversity and how that ended up shaping their take on life. So I always like to delve into that over a couple of minutes.
So it sounds like we have a same favorite question. But one thing in particular that I think is really important for me along the lines of questioning is what's the feedback you're getting? What are you doing with it? And really looking for the receptiveness and the embracing the feedback. And someone that ultimately sees feedback as a tool. When you're growing a company really fast, and I think in more and more also in companies outside of hypergrowth nowadays, so much is going on around you. There's so many feedback channels, there's so much peer feedback, there's so much client feedback, that someone that really sees feedback as a tool and positively and openly receives it, it's one of the most important traits you can look for in someone, because I think you're never gonna hire a perfect employee. So you're hiring someone that's a grown-up and knows who they are and what they need to work on, and where they're at is a close second in my opinion.
Nice. We got about a minute left. Any questions for the panelists before we leave? All right, here's the deal. Go ahead, yes.
Maybe just one quick one. What are some of the tools that you're using that you think are really innovative and fresh in sort of the people and HR space?
Joseph, your tool, of course.
I don't know if I like being called that, but
I didn't say you.
I contend with the definition of that. No, I'll let these guys go first without plugging myself.
I like top funnel on the sourcing side, and actually I'll make a plug for the tool that we're building at Coda. We run our whole business off of our tool, and I think every team is a little bit unique, so building our own applicant tracking system, building the way our teams like to run recruiting directly in our product has worked out really well for us.
Fascinating.
For us, we're using a tool called TalentWall, so we run on agile
Yeah, it's the
processes. We do
visualization.
recruiting sprint, and TalentWall is a visualization tool
Yeah.
that lets recruiting partners and hiring partners see the candidates in every step of the pipeline. So just that level of visibility, I think, is huge.
And it's integrated with Greenhouse, so you use Greenhouse as your ATS.
We use Greenhouse.
Very nice. I want to thank all of y'all for coming. I appreciate it. Could have been anywhere in the world, but you're right here with us, and we appreciate that. I also want to thank the panelists. So a big round of applause for them. Thank you.
We want to thank you for moderating.
All right, thanks is enough. Y'all have a great afternoon.